All right, hello everyone. We have a great crowd already here, and I'm sure more people will trickle in. Thank you all so much for joining us for Left Bank Books welcomes co-founder of the Bosnia Memory Project, now the Center for Bosnian Studies at Fontbonne University, Benjamin Moore, who will discuss his new book, The Names of John Gergen, Immigrant Identities in Early 20th Century St. Louis. Moore will be in conversation with Fontbonne University Associate Professor Casey Williamson. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Benjamin and Casey, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event. So you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event because I will be watching those and getting them ready for the Q&A at the end. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We have so many incredible events lined up and are adding events daily. I added 2 today. About the names of John Gergen. Rescued from the dumpster of a boarded-up house, the yellowing scraps of a young migrant's schoolwork provided Benjamin Moore with the jumping-off point for the study of migration, memory, and identity. Centering on the compelling story of its eponymous subject, The Names of John Gergen examines the converging governmental and institutional forces that affected the lives of migrants in the industrial neighborhoods of South St. Louis in the early 20th century. These migrants were Banat Swabians from the Toronto County in southern Hungary. They were Catholic, agrarian, and ethnically German. Between 1900 and 1920, the St. Louis neighborhoods occupied by migrants were sites of efforts by civic authorities and social reformers to counter the perceived threat of foreignness by attempting to Americanize foreign-born residents. At the same time, these neighborhoods saw the strengthening of Banat Swabians' ethnic identities. Historically, scholars and lay people have understood migrants in terms of their aspirations and transformations, especially their transformations into Americans. The experiences of John Gergen and his kin, however, suggest that identity at the level of the individual was both more fragmented and more fluid than 20th century historians have recognized, subject to a variety of forces that often pulled migrants in multiple directions. Eric Sandweiss, the Indiana University author of St. Louis, The Evolution of an American Urban Landscape, says, "No one has brought into print the details of an individual working class St. Louisan's life in anywhere near the depth that Moore has done. And this from what started as a handful of crumbling school assignments found in a dumpster. Moore's point, however, is for us not simply to discover a once invisible man, but also to reflect upon the extent to which identity itself in this nation, shaped by the collective decisions of the people and institutions that shape our lives and record our traces." About tonight's speakers. Benjamin Moore received his PhD in English literature from the University of Iowa in 1992. He has taught at Fontbonne University in St. Louis, Missouri since 1994. Ben began work on The Names of John Gergen after finding in a dumpster John Gergen's third grade schoolwork, produced during the 1917-1918 school year. For 15 years, he spent his spare time in libraries and research centers across the country learning what he could about young John, his family, and his community. The resulting book is both a biography of John Gergen, who died in 1935, and a social history of Soulard and the Banat Swabian immigrants who once lived there. Ben's growing interest in immigration also led to his work with St. Louis Bosnia's St. Louis's Bosnian refugees. In 2006, he co-founded the Bosnian Memory Project, dedicated to preserving the memory of St. Louis's Bosnians by recording oral histories and collecting personal letters and artifacts. In 2020, the Bosnian Memory Project became the Center for Bosnian Studies, where Ben now serves as senior researcher. And tonight, Ben will be in conversation with Casey Williamson. Casey has taught at Fontbonne University since 2015, where she is now Associate Professor of Communication Studies and Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She earned her PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Minnesota in 2013. She has studied discourse related to race and whiteness in the early 20th century US, and her teaching and writing continues to explore communication, race, and anti-racism. And now, without further ado, I'm very happy and proud to welcome our guests for the evening, Benjamin Moore and Casey Williamson for Left Bank Books. If everyone would please help me in giving them a giant round of applause. Hello.
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 We have an incredible crowd with us here this evening. It is growing just as the minutes tick on. So I'm super excited to have a huge crowd out to celebrate this new book for you.
Thank you so much, Shane. And thanks to Left Bank Books for having us here and hosting this conversation. And thanks for the good work that you do for readers, for authors, for our community that you and your colleagues have done for so long.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the readers of the Names of John Gergen who are joining us and the future readers. And I can't wait for you to start reading this story if you haven't already. And I want to give a shout out to our Fontbonne University colleagues, alumni, students, and other fans of Ben Moore who have joined us tonight to talk about this book and to celebrate Ben. And finally, just one big thanks to the University of Missouri Press, who helped to get this book out into the world.
It was wonderful working with University of Missouri Press, and I want to reiterate that at every step, the staff there were helpful. And I always knew that publishing a book was a collaborative venture, but I never understood it so much until working with the press and seeing this come out. And they've just been terrific to work with. And I would recommend them to any author and certainly to any reader.
And I also want to thank Ben. Thank you for writing this book, for uncovering the story of John Gergen, and for rescuing his story and the story of his family and his community from what might have been forgetting. And
yeah, along with the Bosnian Memory Project, this has been the most satisfying thing I've ever done professionally. And, both are rooted in this sense that people can be forgotten and their experiences can be forgotten. And that, in fact, that's inevitable to a large extent. And the John Gergen was certainly forgotten. I don't want our Bosnian neighbors and future generations to be forgotten. And so we'll see how the conversation goes, but there's a connection between those two things for sure.
I hope we can talk about that. I was hoping you could start us off with a story that I love, which Shane alluded to in the introduction. But I love the way that you initially stumbled on this story, right? The way that you initially crossed paths with young John Gergen. So I wondered if you could start us off by just telling us what happened.
Well, it was in 2004, in August of 2004 to be specific. I've got the specific date in the book, and it's just not coming into my mind right now. But I was jogging in my neighborhood, which adjoins, I live in Benton Park, and it adjoins the neighborhood of Soulard. And so I was jogging down through Soulard around 9th Street and Allen Avenue, which is very close to St. Peter and Paul Church, near the base of the long hill that is the primeval bank of the Mississippi River. And I just happened to turn down an alley because traffic was busy on Allen Avenue. And so I went down the alley behind Allen Avenue, and I came across a construction dumpster, and I can't resist a dumpster, especially one that's overflowing with all kinds of things that looked really juicy. And so I climbed in, and I found a lot of old stuff in the dumpster. But what matters here is the schoolwork that I found that was just scattered across the top like leaves thrown on. most of the dumpster was filled up with construction debris because it was a house that was being renovated. And I gathered up as much of the schoolwork as I could because I was curious, and I took it home and examined it. And it turned out to be the schoolwork that was written in the years 1917 and 1918, or to be more specific, in the academic year that began in the autumn of 1917 and then ended in the spring of 1918. And there was enough information to identify the boy who wrote it. His name was John Gergen. He was 9 years old. He attended Saints Peter and Paul School, elementary school, which was just a block away. And that was a toehold into the ability to do the research that would uncover the relationship of his relationship with his family, which was extremely complicated, his status as an immigrant, which was also extremely complicated. And I just really, over the next 15 years, maybe even got just a little bit obsessed and wanted to find out as much about John Gergen, but also to reconstruct his world and try to understand what St. Louis looked like from the point of view of a boy who would grow up to be a man and would have a hard time of it at every step.
Yeah, as you dove into this research, you discovered that the question, who is John Gergen, wasn't as simple as what one might have thought.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you ran into?
Well, he had at least 7 names at various times in his life. He was actually born he was born with this Hungarian name, János Albek. But even though he lived in southern Hungary when he was born, he was German by ethnicity. And he was therefore called in the home Johann Albek. And when he migrated to St. Louis in 1910 at the age of 2 with his family, well, his father had preceded the family, and he had died just a month or so before the family left their home in the southern part of Hungary known as the Banat. And upon arriving in St. Louis, his mother gave him away, along with her other 2 children who had come. She she got pregnant by another man and married him, and the children went to her siblings, and John went to a woman named Rose Gergen, who had married a man named John Gergen. So it's confusing since there are 2 John Gergens in the story, but he therefore adopted the surname Gergen. And his name went from being János or Johann in the Hungarian or the German to John in the English. And he would eventually, when he applied for his citizenship in 1926, resume using the name John Albek. But at the same time, in other contexts, he was going by his adopted name, Gergen. And what I learned, I mean, the names were fascinating, and they really raised the question of identity and the ways in which migrant identities are constructed and change, and the way that migrants who become immigrants, the way that they acquire new identities, often because of circumstances over which they have no control. And of course, when you acquire a new identity, the other one doesn't go conveniently away. And John's names are a window into the way that, for everyone, I suppose, but especially for people who migrate, the circumstances cause one to acquire these multiple identities that, on the one hand, allows an ability to adapt to different situations, but on the other hand, creates a kind of fragmenting of personhood. And that's what I got really interested in with John Gergen. How is his identity constructed? And what part did he play in the construction of identity, and how much of it was actually something that was a product of other people wanting to shape his agency?
Yeah, one of the examples of the ways that his identity and agency were shaped by outside forces were, in particular, his interactions with schooling, with the education system of his time. I wonder if you might share a little bit of the book with us that highlights some of those intersections.
Yeah, that was really central to the book because, you know, the schoolwork, of course, was the impetus behind examining and studying John Gergen and his family and his community. And I will read a section which comes from the middle of the book in a chapter that is really devoted to analyzing the schoolwork and looking at the schoolwork. And I probably say it better in the book than I could say it right here, so I'll just go ahead and read. The chapter is titled "Have You a Mother?" and it covers the years 1917 and 1918. John, of course, at this time had two mothers: one who was in Chicago with her other family, and then his adoptive mother, Rose Gergen. And he writes in the schoolwork an essay titled "Have You a Mother?" I don't look at John Gergen's schoolwork very often. The pages are fragile and brittle, and when I touch them, crumbs of paper fall off of the edges. I usually consult photo scans that I made soon after I found the schoolwork. But when I do look at the physical pages, they appear less as texts than as artifacts. Their deterioration speaks to the passage of time and the invasion of the elements. Water especially has left its mark, rotting the edges of many of the pages and nurturing the mildew that has left thin crusts of black dust, sometimes obscuring words that I am still trying to read. The staples that once held the sheets together into booklets have long since rusted away. Beneath the staining and decay, we can trace the movements of John Gergen's 9-year-old hand as he struggled to write letters and words in a slanted script that is sometimes fluent and sometimes cramped or jagged. We can even imagine the workings of John's mind as he struggled unsuccessfully to solve math problems and grapple with lessons of all sorts, moral, practical, and intellectual. These 124 pages of schoolwork also represent the educational beliefs and practices of St. Peter and Paul School. In the pages, we see the range of things that the school valued: good handwriting, an appropriate vocabulary, an American history, German Catholicism, and good hygiene. The lessons and their teachers required students to copy, memorize, and write from dictation. To a 9-year-old, the cruelest form of subjection. The writings therefore testify to the interface between the institutional world of parochial schooling and the subjectivity of young John Gergen. To read John's schoolwork is to encounter a part of his personhood and to witness the processes that shaped his emerging public persona, as well as his ability to read, write, remember, calculate, and otherwise think. It is to glimpse the complicated and difficult experience of growing up, of developing identity, and of attaining agency, however imperfectly. The schoolwork may even be an emblem for John himself, labored in the rendering, flawed in the result, and ultimately forgotten.
Thank you. As you read and as I read the other aspects of this book, I was struck by the way these fragments that you describe of documentary evidence begin to take shape into a kind of constellation that depicts the ways that identity is shaped for John Gergen and his family and his community. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you began to witness as you created this constitution, this constellation of institutional intersections.
Well, one of the things I found is, this was a little bit slow in coming, but it was a direct result of the research, which there are just so many sources, I guess for all of us, but certainly for young John, so many sources of his identity. And part of the process of growing up is to put all of these pieces together. You know, for example, in the neighborhood he lived, which is one of the focuses of the book. I like to think of it as a biography of Soulard almost as much as a biography of John Gergen. There were all kinds of institutional authorities that he encountered on a daily basis, and which really affected his relationship to authority and his relationship to his community and his relationship to himself. For example, and many of these institutions were developed specifically to serve the immigrant population in Soulard. Soulard was more than half constituted of people who were born outside of the United States in the early 20th century. He encountered the public library there, the Soulard Branch Library. The building still stands there. And it was a place that not only reading was taught, but also a place that Americanization processes of various kinds were carried out, the teaching of English to, as they were called, foreigners at the time. And various other activities that really promoted patriotism. 4th of July celebrations, for example, often took place right across the street from the Soulard Library and the Soulard Park, which is also still there. There was a bathhouse, which unfortunately was leveled in the 1960s, early 1960s, when the area east of 7th Street was cleared and renamed Kosciuszko. It's now an industrial park, but it's really right across the street from the Soulard Library and the Soulard Market. And the bathhouse was there. And, on the one hand, it was a place where people could go to swim. It was a place where people, of course, could go to bathe. But it also sent the message that immigrants needed to be cleaned up. And on the one hand, there was the interest by the bathhouse authorities and the civic authorities in the neighborhood. It was a city-sponsored bathhouse. There was an interest in how many immigrants actually used this bathhouse. And they kept careful record of how many baths were taken. And this was, of course, to make them hygienic. But it was also, I think, sending a subliminal message that they needed to change, that past that they brought with them needed to be washed off. And they needed to become modern and clean Americans. And right by all of this, just next to the Soulard Branch Library, which was built in 1909, the year after John Gergen was born and the year before he migrated. And the bathhouse was also built in 1909. Just next to the Soulard Market, this building doesn't stand anymore, was the police station, as if there was a kind of reminder that policing authority went hand in hand. That policing behavior, policing, people's lawful day-to-day lives went hand in hand with policing the intellect and policing the body in the bathhouse. And these are messages that are sent through the built environment and the institutions that occupy these buildings, that a person needs to behave in a certain way. And their values, in other words, associated with these institutions. And this is what was instilled in John Gergen as he was taught really to become a progressive era American. At the same time, of course, he had a home life where day-to-day activity was mediated in the German language that was spoken in southern Hungary, which was a little bit different from the German language that was spoken in Germany proper, and a little bit different from the German language that he learned in school at St. Peter and Paul School. It was a dialect of German that had been preserved by people who had migrated to southern Hungary back in the 1700s. So there was this other identity that was a remnant of the agrarian background that his foster parents had brought with them, and that was also part of John Gergen's experience. And I often imagine John in his day-to-day life when he goes from home to school, or when he goes from home to the branch library or to the bathhouse, is in the process of mediating that complex relationship between the environment of the home, where one language is spoken, the environment of St. Peter and Paul School, where another version of that language is spoken, and then the environment of the library or the bathhouse, where yet another language is spoken. And in a sense, each of these places requires a different persona. And that's part of what an immigrant's job is, if you will, is to somehow negotiate between all of those different demands that are placed by all of these different cultures that one encounters in one's life. I guess I should also mention, one other thing I want to mention, because I think it's really important to the story of John. He was academically challenged, and according to the terms of the day, he was called a retardate, and he was considered to be pedagogically retarded because he had fallen a year behind in school, and because he had to take extra classes during the summer in order not to catch up. He never caught up, but just to not lose any more ground than he had. And I think school was very frustrating for him. He dropped out right after turning 14 and went into the workforce without ever completing the 7th grade. And most working class people were able to continue in school until the 8th grade, and some even went on to high school. So John not only had a difficult time in school, but he was also somebody who saw his own education foreshortened because of leaving school early. And I think that has a lot to do with who he was, because this is sending a message that goes along with the message that is sent by other institutions. As an immigrant, you're inferior and need to be changed. And now, pardon me for using this word, but it's the word that is used at the time, as a retardate. You are inferior, and you're not going to accomplish a lot. And one of the things that John certainly, I think, ended up doing was internalizing those designations, which limited what he could become. In many ways, the book is a tragedy. John died young. He died in 1935 at age 26, and that's tragic. But I think the real tragedy in John's life is that in so many different ways, the system limited the degree to which he could achieve happiness. Mm-hmm. Instead, he became one of those people who really works on behalf of achieving happiness for others. He became a worker, an iron worker, and worked for a wage. And there were some small achievements that he was able to make in his life, but not a lot. And that's a story that I really feel needs to be told, every much as the stories of those people who did accomplish a lot.
Thank you. There are these this theme of memory and forgetting. Mm-hmm. Is an important one in this book and in your other work. So you said just a moment ago, this is a story that needs to be told, and that reminds me of the connection and the resonance back to your work on the Bosnian Memory Project and now the Center for Bosnian Studies. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about those connections and about the way that this idea of memory and forgetting has motivated your work.
There's seldom been an explicit connection between the John Gergen project and the Bosnian Memory Project. And in fact, many of my Bosnian friends do not even know that I've been working on this book during the time that we've been developing the Bosnian Memory Project. But there is a connection. I mentioned one earlier when I said, John's been forgotten. And so many people like him have been forgotten. Countless people like him have been forgotten. They're just not a part of the historical record. And I don't want that to happen to the people from Bosnia who migrated here because of the war and the genocide in Bosnia. That was the reason that they came here. The people who expelled them through ethnic cleansing wanted them to be forgotten. And I have felt that it's important for them to tell their own stories in their own words, which was an opportunity that people like John Gergen never received. So I think in some ways, I found the manuscript in 2004. I really began earnest work on the project in 2005. And we began, along with my good friend and colleague, Jack Lutskow, and now working with Rebecca Van Neest and Adna Karamea-Jotes at Fontbonne, We began the Bosnian Memory Project in 2006, and it's now become the Center for Bosnian Studies as of 2020. And I think there is a connection, but because the way we remember and what we remember and whom we remember is a choice that's not just an academic question, it's an ethical question. And far too often, the memory gets, the memory goes in the direction of people who already have privilege. And that's what both of these projects, I think, are seeking to address. Of course, so much gets forgotten anyway. It's just the way in which life works.
I'm also thinking a lot from this conversation and previous conversations we've had and reading the names of John Gergen about the way that these memories, though they are maybe consciously forgotten, they slip out of the stories that we tell. Mm-hmm. But as you start to look at the social history of Soulard as revealed in the documents and the institutions that are, materially present or since demolished, but that memory forms our material reality in a way that we're not always aware of. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of discovery for you as you understood Soulard in a deeper way, and the way that these institutional labels and categories and stratifications have shaped our environment in St. Louis?
Yeah, that's a huge question and a really important one, and I probably won't be able to do it justice. But in researching the neighborhoods, the built environment that John Gergen and his family lived in, one of the things that I saw, of course, was the way that built environment shaped who they were and how they related to other people. And one of the things that happened in 1920 was that the Gergen family moved out of Soulard. They moved from the house at it was a tenement actually, the tenement at 916 Allen Avenue. And by tenement, I mean a house that had been divided up into apartments. They moved from that apartment that they had to a duplex in the Gravois Park neighborhood. And then in 1923, moved from there to the Bevo Mill neighborhood. And one of the things that they were doing, consciously or unconsciously, was in addition to becoming, when they moved to the Bevo Mill neighborhood in 1923, in addition to becoming homeowners, they were really increasingly staking their claim within a racially segregated society. And this is taught to them in so many different ways. It's not a racially segregated society of their making, but they enter into it in 1910, and they then become invested in it in various ways. And one of those ways is through the places that they live and the home that they eventually own, a small cottage on Taft Avenue, 4147 Taft Avenue, in just around the corner from the Bevo Mill in 1923. And they could be assured, and whether this mattered to them, I have no idea. I have no idea what their understanding of race was. I have no idea what their own concept of being white was. But they could be assured that in buying in this neighborhood, they would not have African-American neighbors. But because real estate developers really refused, almost as an article of their own conscience, their own stake in preserving this racist society, refused to sell in that part of St. Louis to people who were African American. And so, when we look at a number of things in the book, from the cost of food during World War I to the relationships that people established because of their lives in the tenements between 1900 or for the Gergens between 1910 and 1920, to their movement into these more recently developed subdivisions in South City, we can see a lot of the different ways that their concepts of themselves shifted, and their sense of their relationship to other people shifted. One thing, of course, that happened during World War I was the fact that being German was something that was demonized. And I think that this is asserted pressure over the Gergens to become more American, and perhaps that even led, after World War I was over, to their moving to Gravois Park and purchasing, along with some other family members, a duplex in 1920. And but because it's a way to prove your Americanness, it's a way to try to escape your immigrant background, it's a way to try to cure oneself of the deficiencies that the system is constantly telling you that you have, because of the fact that you're of agrarian background from this backwater place in Hungary, and you're just not as good as people who are of other extractions and have been in the United States for a longer time. I also think this puts pressure on people in the early 20th century to buy in, people who are white, to buy into white privilege. And I think that the kind of what's the word I want? The kind of degradation that many immigrants from Southeastern Europe experienced during their first years in St. Louis during the early 20th century made, in a very perverse and cruel way, white privilege more attractive. I don't know if that's getting at some of the things in your question, but those are some things that come to mind.
I think it is. And the way that, there is this risk of these stories slipping our notice, and this risk of these stratifications seeming natural, right? That the whiteness of these neighborhoods seems accidental, and it is, of course, entirely, right, not entirely the product of a racist society. But what your book showed me is that all of these stories are they are present, right? They are present in the documents. They are present in the, I think you say, the warp and weft of the neighborhood, and the relationships to institutions, and the way that institutions have come and gone.
Yeah.
And it made me see the landscape of our city in a different way, and helped me to look, I think, with more curiosity and wonder, right? That anytime I might walk down the street and see, one child's left behind objects, right? Mm-hmm. That there might be a multitude of stories there.
Yeah.
There's a passage from the end of your book that I think captures nicely the way that that your perspective changed as you walked this path with John Gergen. Would you read that for us?
I will. And this is from the very end. Sometimes on my walks, I stop at 1855 Menard Street, where Anna Berger, who is an aunt of John's, a sister of his foster mother and a sister of his birth mother, where Anna Gergen gave birth to a stillborn son. The building there is gone. Now new row houses stand there, built during the pandemic of 2020. Looking northwest through the chain link fence across the chasm that holds the highway, and this is Interstate 4455, which cut right through Soulard when it was built. I can see the roof of the old city hospital where Peter Allbeck and the elder John Gergen both died. And they were John Gergen's birth father and John Gergen's foster father. Yet the hospital has been converted to luxury apartments. A little closer to the highway are the former grounds of the St. Louis Cordage Company, where workers once died in gruesome accidents. A new Protestant church stands there now. The cordage factory itself burned to the ground in 1994 in a spectacular fire that sent debris tumbling onto the southbound lanes of Interstate 44. Arson was suspected. Now the noise of the traffic makes it difficult to hear anything else. It is easy to get lost watching the patterns of the trucks and cars merging and changing lanes where hundreds of people once lived and died. As for young John Gergen, daily I wonder about him things that I cannot know. So many questions could be answered if I could only find the right documents. Others are impenetrable. Did he ever meet his half-brothers and half-sisters? Did he travel? Did he read? What were his favorite books? Did he go to the movies? Did he drive a car? Did he miss his birth mother? Did he forgive her? Or was forgiveness even an issue? Was he able to adjust his expectations about life and accept the limits that were placed on it by his birth father's death, by his failure to achieve in school, by his foster father's disability, and by his own tuberculosis? At what point did he understand that his life was coming to an early end? Did he fear it? Was he able to accept the fact that the possibilities that give meaning to the lives of so many of us were simply not available to him? But there are no answers. Sometimes I imagine finding more documents, and not just in my waking hours. Once, in an image from my own childhood, I dreamed of finding bushel baskets full of John's letters and diaries sitting beside a field of green beans. But I am convinced there is nothing more that can be known about John Gergen, nor could any account of research redeem the hard truth that John's thoughts and memories died with him. John is therefore what all of us have the potential to be. None of us can be certain that we will be remembered, or for that matter, that we will be forgotten. But if we are not consigned to oblivion, then it will be the institutional identities that remain, the names, the vital records, and the fragments of expression that will offer glimpses into who we once were.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Such a thoughtful passage. I really appreciated the readings that you did.
Thank you.
We have a great audience here. I want to remind the audience to type up questions in the comments. I'm certain that you probably have some. I have some. One of them that is being asked by someone else, so I will let them ask it. But I do want to share some comments as well. We have Robin saying, thank you. Krista, such an incredible, powerful, interesting book. Enjoying this read very much. And a comment from Claire, who will be our first question. Claire is saying, so excited to be here and celebrate Dr. Moore and his work. Hi, Dr. Moore and Dr. Williamson. I have a question. When you found the documents all those years ago, did you know immediately that you were going to dig deeper and write a book?
No. Took me about a year to get there. Yeah, I was working on some other things. It was a point of transition for me because I was moving from my interest in English literature to my interest in migration at that time. But it took me a little while. I dabbled in it, and it was one of those things that I would say I went from curiosity to interest, and then from interest into obsession, and then obsession into research. So there were some stages to this, and I was really glad I was in a point of my career where I wasn't forced to publish, because I may have tried to finish this project too soon, or I may have never pursued it at all. It's one of the benefits of having tenure, that you can go and pursue avenues that sometimes take years to unfold. But it's a good question, Claire, and no, I didn't. It was a little while before I knew I was going to take it this far.
So kind of branching off of that, when you did stumble upon it, and when it did kind of dawn on you that this was something that was going to be a passion project of yours, did you ever fear that you were going to hit a dead end, that it just wouldn't culminate in something that you could produce in such a quality work?
I did from time to time. And I had some help in two different ways. One is that the family helped me, and specifically a cousin of John Gergens, who, when I met her, was in her 70s. She was a young cousin. In fact, she was John Gergens' birth daughter. And in fact, she's the baby that you see depicted on the cover of the book. That is her christening, and John Gergen was her godfather, and hence the the picture was made, she gave me a lot of photographs of John Gergen and of other members of the family, and told me things about the family that helped to fill in some of the blank spaces. And then John Gergen's niece, who still lives in the Bebo Mill neighborhood and is in her 90s now, she did the same thing. And, on the one hand, they didn't remember a lot because they were very young when John Gergen died. But on the other hand, they helped me put John Gergen in a context of continuity so that I could think a bit about the relationship between where he was when he was growing up and where society has gone and where his family has gone. So that was very helpful. The other thing that was very useful was the fact that so many sources during the period that I was writing this, from 2000, or researching this anyway, from 2005 until the book came out, came online and actually became available electronically during that period. It was just a period of an explosion of sources that could be searched online. And that made, I don't know that this book could have been written and this research could have been done before 2005. So it was just fortunate that I found it when I did. And, at a point in history when new methods of research were becoming available.
Patrick is asking, why was German taught at St. Peter and Paul's School?
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting question. The founding order, now it sounds French, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, but it was actually a German order that originated in Bavaria. And they considered it part of their mission to teach the catechism and other religious writings in German. So not only was the German language being taught, but also at St. Peter and Paul, half of the curriculum every day was taught in German, and that included history and religion. So John's catechism was actually a German catechism. And it was just the deep investment in German culture that particular order had. We have forgotten, I think, that a lot of St. Louis had a deep investment in German culture in the early 20th century, and indeed in the late 19th and mid-19th century, because so many Germans migrated from what is now Germany proper to St. Louis in the years following the 1848 revolutions in Europe. And many of them were bourgeoisie, and they had high levels of education and had really established a lot of businesses and preserved their culture, both Catholic culture and Protestant culture. And in fact, just down the street from St. Peter and Paul is the Trinity Lutheran Church, which is also rooted in German background. Of course, when the Banat Swabians began coming, and some 5,000 of those settled in Soulard, and they were a big proportion of the Soulard's population. When they began coming in 1903 and continued coming until about 1914, they were a different group of Germans, and they were looked down upon by the German establishment in St. Louis because of the fact that their language wasn't perceived as being of good quality. In other words, because they weren't really real Germans. They were these Slavic, Hungarian Germans who were down there in southeastern Europe at the borderland between Serbia and Hungary. And so they had a very different history. And that history of the Banat Swabians has really not been explored, even though there are tens of thousands of people in St. Louis who are descended from them.
Jane is asking, could you speak a bit about experiences in Soulard and John's young life? I remember you speaking about John's interest in socialism.
Yeah, and that came a little bit later, and it may have been a product of the fact that his father, his foster father, that is, had a debilitating stroke and was out of work for a long period of time. So John joined an organization that was, on the one hand, a life insurance and health insurance organization, and on the other hand, a socialist, a very leftist socialist, I would say communist organization. And this was the organization that he belonged to during the period of time that he fought tuberculosis and eventually succumbed to it. So he joined it in 1928 and he died in 1935. I think that it was a way out of some of the degradation that he had experienced in the workplace and the schools, and that it gave him a way to oppose a lot of the structures, institutional and economic structures, which had really put him in the position of being a worker and a nobody. It gave him a way, in other words, of attaining a kind of agency that may have offered him some kind of relief during his last years, which were extremely difficult years for him because of his illness and because of the Great Depression and the fact that not only could he not work, not only could his foster father not work because of his foster father's disability, having suffered paralysis and epilepsy as a result of the stroke, but others in his family were also out of work because of the Depression and because of the drop in industrial production. So I think that period of time, the last years of his life, I think that leftist socialism really gave him something that he didn't have otherwise. It gave him a way of belonging to something, and it gave him a way of thinking critically about his position in life.
Dr. Foshi, or that might not be their actual name, it's Dr. Foshi's lifespan development class is asking, so I don't know if that's actually the person or that is an organization. Ben, do you know why the family decided to throw away John's papers in the dumpster, and did they keep any of his artifacts?
They did not keep any of his artifacts. All of that has been lost. And I think that they lived in the apartment where the family lived in the apartment near where I found John Gergens' Schoolwork from 1915 to 1920. And I think when they moved in 1920 to the Gravois Park neighborhood, the papers were just in a closet somewhere, and they were forgotten and left behind. And there were other families that occupied those apartments in the house between 1920 and whenever it became vacant, which was sometime in the 1990s. And I've done a little research on what happened to that house afterwards, and it remained a house that was divided into apartments, and it's now vacant still. And so it wasn't the family so much throwing them away as just, I think, abandoning them, forgetting about them, and moving on to other things. And this was third grade schoolwork, so John's in the fifth grade now, so it's just not valuable, or maybe it was just hidden away from everybody and they couldn't see it in a closet or an attic or somewhere. But I think it's curious that other than a few photographs, there is nothing else that remains of young John Gergen. Nothing. That's it. No citizenship certificate except what's on file in Homeland Security's archives. No diaries, no letters, nothing. I mean, all of that has disappeared. And while people lived in those small working class houses in South City, maybe they didn't have room to keep a lot. And maybe they just needed to move on with their lives, and therefore the things that tied them back to the past are gone. What I would give for being able to find more of these documents that could somehow be tied back to John Gergen.
And I think that speaks a lot about what history we are able to access still.
It does.
Because so much of the history that we are given is the history of the rich and the powerful.
It is.
And you, thankfully, are telling a story about someone who, from what you could find, that is not frequently told. So, and for clarification, that was Becky that was asking the question. So, and then two more questions I think we have time for. I want to save Jenna's for last, but Kathy's asking, do you think a situation like this is able to happen, being forgotten in a sense today with all the digital footprints a majority of people have?
Wow, what a great question. I think I'll just admire the question. I don't know that I can answer it, but it is a terrific question. And I really don't know the answer, because I know that there are some people who have become very good at mining that digital presence. And it may be too early to tell. I think what's going to happen is that our concept of what it means to be remembered is going to change in the digital age. But I can't say much more than that. But I think that, let me just say that's a wonderful question. And maybe over the next years, we'll be able to see some things that will enlighten us. I'm afraid we may have the opposite problem that we have with people like John Gergen, which is simply having too much information and not really being able to distill it into something that is meaningful and represents our understanding of what a person was. But it's a great question.
Last question is going to be from Jenna. What's the next book that's brewing, Dr. Moore? You have plans for more dumpster diving, or did a story already on your heart, or a story already on your heart that needs to find the page?
Well, I'm interested, and this is a spin-off project from the John Gergen book. I'm interested in researching and writing about food relief efforts during World War I here in St. Louis, and especially those conducted by an organization called the Women's Central Committee on Food Conservation. It was an organization which was middle-class women who began working with working class people, working class men, women, and children during the war, because of the fact, during World War I, because of the fact that food was getting very expensive and very scarce, because so much of it was being shipped overseas for the war effort. And it was an interesting reality check on a lot of the middle class women who were conducting this work. And it was a moment in St. Louis and American history when middle class values were actually shaped by working class foodways and knowledge. It's something I want to explore a lot more thoroughly. A community kitchen in Soulard is mentioned in the book in just a couple of paragraphs as being one of the ways in which during World War I, working class people were able to sustain themselves. And that community kitchen was sponsored by the Women's Central Committee on Food Conservation. They actually employed neighborhood cooks who cooked the food of Southeastern Europe. And some of these recipes were published in the Post-Dispatch. So it was a moment, I think, that didn't last, but it was a moment where you saw a convergence of the interests of two different classes of people in St. Louis with really interesting and positive results. So I think that's what the next book is going to be. It's going to be food conservation and food relief efforts during World War I in St. Louis. With recipes.
So we did have two questions kind of roll in at the last minute. And I do want to ask one, since we do have maybe just a tiny amount of time left. Another question, well, this is actually from Jasna. Can you comment on John's personality from what you have uncovered?
You know, I think that's such an interesting question. And I don't know how much of what I'm going to say is of my own manufacture and how much of it is driven by the evidence. I think a lot of it is driven by the evidence. I think he was gentle. I think he was unassuming. I think he was quiet. I think he was awkward. He was extremely tall for his age. And when he fell a year behind in school, he was very tall compared to his schoolmates. I think he was somebody who probably experienced a lot of humility in life. And I think that he's somebody, therefore, who was not outgoing, but instead more introverted. I do know, and I think this is something that maybe sheds light on the question of personality. He was a lover of music, and he played both the clarinet and the saxophone. And I know that for two reasons. One is that his goddaughter and cousin remembered that and told me that in an interview I did of her back in 2006. And the other reason I know that is because after he died, his clarinet and saxophone were listed in the classified ads of that was a classified advertisement that was published by his foster mother, Rose Gergen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Stumbling upon that must have been like such a miraculous amount of luck and like skill to find a want or like a classified ad. That's amazing. We are out of time, unfortunately, but a lot of really great comments, a lot of great people, including the University of Missouri Press, thanking you for this incredible conversation, thanking Left Bank Books, but also big thanks to you, Ben and Casey. Really just an incredible conversation, an incredible topic. Really very thankful that we were able to discuss this book tonight and to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Shane, and thank you, Casey.
Thank you, Ben.
All right. Well, to the audience watching, I hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to order books from Left Bank Books. I put the link for this book up in the comments as well, twice as a reminder. So it is available from Left Bank Books. And also check out our event calendar while you're there and see all of the fantastic events that we have coming up in the month of May. A lot of really fantastic events, including a sneak peek for another fantastic local interest author that isn't quite up on the calendar yet, but will be up soon. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic evening, and we will see you again really soon.